The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn soles of her boots and the threadbare wool of her cloak, a merciless parasite that fed on what little warmth she possessed. Ilara's fingers were numb, clumsy as she sorted the firewood, the rough bark scraping skin already raw from scrubbing floors and washing laundry in near-frozen water. Each splinter that pierced her flesh was a familiar sting, a reminder of her place. She was nothing, an omega, an orphan left behind when her small, insignificant pack had been absorbed by the larger, more powerful Stone Creek pack. They had taken her in, a charity case, and never let her forget it. Her existence was a tapestry woven from chores, hunger, and the quiet, crushing weight of invisibility. A gust of wind, sharp as a wolf's tooth, tore through the woodshed, making the loose planks groan. Ilara flinched, pulling the thin cloak tighter. It smelled of lye soap and damp wool, the scent of her life. She tried to remember the smell of her mother's embrace, of pine and summer rain, but the memory was a faded watercolor, washed out by years of loneliness. She was sorting the driest logs for the Alpha's hearth, a task that fell to her every evening. The best for them, the damp, smoky cast-offs for the communal fire she was sometimes allowed to share. It was the way of things. The strong took, the weak gave. Her stomach twisted into a tight, aching knot. She had not eaten since the morning's thin gruel, and the scent of roasting meat drifting from the main lodge was a form of exquisite torture. She focused on the wood, on the grain, the weight, the feel of it in her hands. It was real. It was solid. Unlike her. Sometimes she felt she might simply fade away, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's brighter, warmer lives. She would become another whisper in the wind, another forgotten name. The thought brought a cold dread that was sharper than any winter chill.
Look what the frost dragged in.
The voice was slick with contempt, and Ilara's shoulders hunched instinctively. Lyra, the pack Alpha's daughter. She stood in the woodshed doorway, flanked by two of her friends, their expressions mirroring her own sneering superiority. They were wrapped in thick furs, their cheeks flushed with warmth and wine. "I'm just finishing the firewood, Lyra," Ilara murmured, her gaze fixed on the logs in her arms. Looking up was an invitation for more creative cruelty. "Still playing with sticks, Omega?" Lyra stepped forward, her expensive leather boots scuffing through the wood chips on the floor. "Pathetic. My father should have cast you out years ago. You're a drain on our resources." The words were not new. Ilara had heard them, or variations of them, 1,000 times. They were stones thrown at her day after day, and while she had learned to shield her heart, each one still left a small, painful bruise. She said nothing, simply adding another log to the pile in her arms. "Are you deaf?" one of Lyra's friends, Kara, taunted. She shoved Ilara's shoulder, not hard, but enough to make her stumble. The carefully balanced stack of wood tumbled from her arms, scattering across the floor with a hollow clatter. Ilara stared at the fallen logs. All that work, undone. A hot, bitter feeling rose in her throat. It was the injustice that stung the most, the sheer, pointless meanness of it all. "Clumsy thing," Lyra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Now you have to do it all over again. Make sure it's perfect. We have an important visitor tonight. You wouldn't want to disappoint him, would you?" A visitor? Important enough to warrant Lyra's preening? Ilara's stomach tightened for a different reason now. Strangers were unpredictable. They could mean a change in routine, which was always, always bad for her. "Clean it up," Lyra commanded, her voice sharp with finality. She kicked one of the logs, sending it rolling into a dark corner. Then, with a final dismissive sniff, she and her friends turned and walked away, their laughter echoing back into the cold, dim shed. Ilara sank to her knees, the rough floor pressing into her bones. For a long moment she did not move. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Crying was a weakness, a luxury she could not afford. She gritted her teeth, the sound a faint scrape in the quiet shed. She would not break. That was the one thing she still owned, the stubborn, unyielding core of herself that refused to shatter. They could humiliate her, starve her, work her until her bones ached, but they could not break her. Slowly, deliberately, she began to pick up the logs again. Her hands were clumsy with cold, her movements stiff, but she worked with a grim determination. Each piece of wood she reclaimed from the dusty floor was a small act of defiance, a silent scream that she was still here. She still existed. The air in the Stone Creek Pack's great hall was thick with tension. It clung to the heavy wooden beams and settled over the long tables like a shroud. Ilara felt it the moment she entered, a low hum of anxiety that was entirely separate from her own. She moved along the walls, a shadow in her drab gray dress, refilling goblets with spiced wine, her eyes downcast. Everyone was here. Every member of the pack, dressed in their finest leathers and furs, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They were all turned toward the high table, where their alpha, a burly, stern-faced man named Fendrel, sat beside the visitor. And what a visitor he was! Ilara risked a glance, a fleeting, dangerous peek from beneath her lashes. The man, the king, they were whispering, was a creature of scale and presence. He was not merely large. He seemed to occupy more space than his physical form, drawing the light and air toward him. He sat with an unnerving stillness, a predator at rest, his power a palpable force in the room. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the firelight behind him, his hair the color of midnight, and his face was all harsh, beautiful lines, as if carved from mountain granite. But it was his eyes that held her captive for that brief, stolen second. They were not a normal color. They were molten gold, shimmering with an ancient, unnerving light. They scanned the room with a lazy disinterest that was somehow more intimidating than open aggression. He looked bored and lonely. The thought was so strange, so out of place, that Ilara immediately dismissed it. What would a king know of loneliness? He had come with a strange request. That was the rumor that had been flying all day. He was not here for tribute or territory. He was looking for someone, a tutor, for his wards. The word pups had been used, spoken with a kind of reverence. Orphaned children of his own slain guard, taken in as his own. The idea was so bizarre it had been met with disbelief, then frantic scrambling. Every eligible daughter with a modicum of education had been paraded before him. Lyra had been practically vibrating with ambition, her smile wide and false as she'd presented herself. The king had dismissed them all with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, his golden eyes never losing their bored, searching quality. Now dinner was a strained affair. Fendrel was sweating, his attempts at conversation falling flat against the king's monolithic silence. Ilara continued her work, a ghost at the feast. She was safe in her invisibility. He would never see her. She was less than the dust motes dancing in the firelight. A commotion near the hall's entrance drew a few eyes. Ilara saw two small figures slip past the guards. Children. A boy and a girl, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in fine but practical northern clothes. Their eyes were wide, taking in the spectacle of the hall. The king's wards. Before any guard could intercept them, the little girl, her hair in 2 dark braids, saw something that made her face light up. She pointed, not at the feast, not at the glittering finery, but at a small, intricately carved wooden bird Ilara had left on a side table. She had found it in the woods and spent weeks slowly, secretly whittling it with a stolen knife, a tiny piece of beauty in her gray world. She had forgotten it there in her haste. The girl darted forward, her small boots silent on the stone floor. She snatched up the bird, her expression one of pure delight. Her brother followed, more cautious. They were immediately surrounded by Fendrel's guards, their faces grim. "Your Majesty," Fendril began, half rising from his seat, his face purpling with embarrassment. "My apologies. The children are mine," the king's voice cut through the hall. It was not loud, but it resonated deep in Alara's bones, a low, rumbling thunder that silenced every other sound. "Let them be." The guards backed away as if struck. The king's golden eyes finally shifted, a slow, deliberate movement, and settled on his wards. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a softening of the granite lines of his face, appeared for a moment. He watched as the little girl showed the bird to her brother. Then the girl looked up, her gaze searching the room. Her eyes, a clear and startling blue, met Alara's. She held up the bird and smiled, a bright, innocent thing. And in that moment, the universe tilted. Because the king's gaze followed his ward's. The weight of his attention fell upon Alara like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs. The golden eyes were no longer bored. They were focused, intense, and utterly fixed on her. The room, the noise, the people, it all melted away into a blur of insignificance. There was only the silent, crushing pressure of his stare. He had seen her. For a creature who had spent her life cultivating invisibility, being seen by him felt like being laid bare, soul and all, under a midday sun. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He was looking at her. Why was he looking at her? He rose from his seat. The movement was fluid, impossibly graceful for a man his size. The entire hall held its breath. He did not look at Fendril. He did not look at anyone else. He simply walked toward her. Each step was a hammer blow against her heart. Step, step, step. The floor seemed to vibrate with his approach. She was trapped, pinned by his gaze like a moth to a board. She should run. She should hide. But her feet were rooted to the stone floor, her body refusing to obey the frantic screaming of her mind. He was a force of nature, an avalanche, and she was a sapling in its path. He stopped less than an arm's length from her. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to see his face. The scent of pine and winter storms and something else, something wild and male and powerful, enveloped her, stealing the air from her lungs. It was overwhelming, intoxicating. He looked from her face down to her hands, still clutching a heavy wine pitcher. Her knuckles were red and chapped, her nails broken, a testament to her life of servitude. Shame washed over her, hot and fierce. Then he looked back at her eyes. Up close, his were even more mesmerizing. Not just gold, but flecked with silver, like a starry nebula. They held an ancient wisdom, a profound loneliness she had sensed from across the room, and something else now, a dawning, staggering recognition. "You," he said. His voice was a low rumble, meant for her alone, yet it seemed to shake the very foundations of her being. He reached out. His movement was slow, deliberate, giving her time to flee, but she could not move. She could only watch as his large, calloused hand, a hand that could surely snap a tree branch as easily as a twig, came toward her. He was not reaching for her face or her arm. He was reaching for the pitcher. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the weight of it. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a cataclysm of heat and light that erupted at the point of their contact. It was a lightning strike to her soul. Searing, white-hot energy flooded her veins, a roaring inferno that burned away the cold that had lived in her bones for a lifetime. Pain and pleasure crashed together in a tidal wave, so intense she could not tell one from the other. A scream tore from her throat, but it was lost in the roaring in her own ears. Her vision went white. The pitcher slipped from her grasp and shattered on the floor, the dark wine spreading like blood. She was falling, tumbling into a blinding abyss of pure sensation. But she did not hit the floor. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against a chest as hard and unyielding as a rock wall. The contact was electric, 1,000 more lightning strikes all at once. Through the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel the impossible heat of his body, the thundering, steady beat of his heart. She gasped, her head falling back, and she saw it. On the back of her own hand, the one he had touched, a mark was burning itself into existence. Swirling lines of silver and gold light etched themselves onto her skin, twisting and coalescing into a complex, beautiful symbol, a howling wolf's head crowned with a crescent moon. It glowed with an ethereal light, searing hot, branding her not just on her skin, but on her very essence. Her terrified, disbelieving gaze flew to his face. His jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His eyes were no longer molten gold. They were blazing, a pure, incandescent silver, and they were filled with a possessiveness so absolute, so primal, it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He lowered his head, his breath ghosting across her cheek, hot and smelling of winter. "Mine," he growled, the word a vibration that resonated through her entire body. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as the rising of the sun. He had found her. He had claimed her. And Alara, the worthless Omega, the invisible girl, knew with a terrifying, soul-deep certainty that her life was over. And it had just begun. Confusion was a thick fog in her mind. One moment she was a servant, invisible and insignificant. The next, she was held in the arms of a king, branded by a magic she did not understand, her body humming with a strange, terrifying energy. The entire great hall was silent, every eye fixed on them in stunned disbelief. Kaelin. The name had come to her in the flash of their connection, a piece of him now lodged in her soul, did not release her. He held her as if she were made of spun glass and steel, his grip unyielding but careful. Her head spun, the sense of pine and storm and him filling her senses, drowning out everything else. What was happening? The question was a frantic bird beating its wings inside her skull. This could not be real. It was a dream, a fever dream brought on by hunger and cold. Soon she would wake up on her thin straw mattress, the only heat the memory of this impossible moment. But the mark on her hand still burned, a constant, searing reminder. It was real. The heat of his body against hers was real. The thunder of his heart against her ear was real. He turned his head slightly, his blazing silver eyes finding Fendrel. The pack alpha looked as if he had swallowed a stone, his face pale with shock and a dawning, terrible understanding. "She is my mate," Kaelin announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. There was no room for argument. It was a declaration of cosmic law. "She will be coming with me." Mate. The word struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. A mate was a partner, an equal, a soul-bound other half. Such things were for alphas, for betas, for people who mattered. Not for her. Not for an omega, a cast-off, a nothing. It was impossible. A mistake. But, Your Majesty," Fendrel stammered, finally finding his voice. She is an omega, a servant. She is no one." A low growl rumbled in Kaelin's chest, a dangerous, predatory sound that made the very air vibrate. His arm tightened around Alara, pulling her even closer, shielding her with his body. "She is my queen," he snarled, and the words were laced with so much menace that Fendrel physically recoiled. Queen. The word was even more absurd than mate. Alara wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. She looked past Kaelin's shoulder and saw Lyra's face. It was a mask of pure, venomous hatred, her beautiful features twisted into an ugly snarl. The ambition in her eyes had been replaced by a murderous fury. That look terrified Alara more than anything else. Kaelin seemed to feel her tremor of fear. He shifted his attention back to her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, right beside the glowing mark. The touch sent a fresh wave of heat through her, but this time it was soothing, a balm on her frayed nerves. "I have you," he murmured, his voice for her alone. It was a promise, a vow. Her instincts, ancient and deep, screamed at her to trust him, to lean into his strength, to accept this impossible reality. Her body already felt like it belonged to him, every nerve ending alive and attuned to his presence. But her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of abuse and self-loathing, recoiled. This was a trick, a cruel joke. He would realize his mistake soon enough. He would see her for what she was, worthless, used, broken. And he would cast her aside. The fall from this height would kill her. "No," she whispered, the word barely a breath. It was an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to cling to the miserable safety of her old life. "Please, I can't." His silver eyes searched hers, and for a moment she saw not a king, but a man who had waited for centuries. She saw the echoing loneliness she had sensed before, and a flash of raw, heart-stopping vulnerability. He had found his other half, and she was rejecting him. The flicker of pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "I will not leave you here," he said, his voice soft but absolute. He seemed to understand her fear, the source of her disbelief. "This is not a place for you." He glanced around the hall, at the gawking faces, at Lyra's hatred, at Fendrell's fear. His gaze was filled with contempt. "This is a cage. I am taking you home." Home. The word was a foreign country she had never visited. She had no home. She had a place to sleep, a place to work, but not a home. He did not wait for her to agree. With a final, dismissive look at Fendrell, he began to walk, sweeping her along with him. He moved with an unhurried, regal grace, parting the stunned crowd of shifters as if they were reeds in a river. No one dared to get in his way. Alara was forced to stumble along with him, her feet barely touching the ground, her world narrowed to the circle of his arm, the scent of his skin, and the terrifying, exhilarating beat of his heart. His two small wards, who had been watching with wide, solemn eyes, fell into step behind him. The little girl clutched the wooden bird to her chest like a precious treasure. They looked at Alara not with shock, but with a quiet, hopeful curiosity. They left the great hall and stepped out into the biting winter night. The cold air was a shock to Alara's system after the overwhelming heat of the bond. Kalen never hesitated. He led her past his own guards, who stood like stone sentinels, their faces impassive but their eyes tracking her with keen interest. He was taking her to his own carriage, a large, dark conveyance that was more fortress than vehicle. He was really doing it. He was taking her. Panic, sharp and real, finally broke through her daze. She planted her feet, pulling against his grip for the first time. "Wait," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "My things." It was a foolish, desperate excuse. She owned nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and a few hoarded trinkets hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She had nothing worth taking. Kalen stopped and looked down at her. The moonlight caught the silver in his eyes, making them glow. "You will have everything," he said simply. "You need nothing from this place." He released her waist only to lift her, swinging her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Alara gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders to steady herself. The muscles there were like solid rock beneath his tunic. He held her high against his chest, cradling her like something precious, and strode the last few feet to the carriage, placing her gently inside on a plush, fur-lined seat. He was about to turn away, presumably to let his wards in, when he paused. He leaned into the carriage, one hand resting on the doorframe, boxing her in. His face was close, his golden silver eyes intense. "They will never touch you again," he vowed, his voice a low, dangerous promise. "No one will ever harm you again." He was not just talking about Fendrel or the pack. He was talking about the life she had lived, the pain she had endured. He saw it. He saw the years of quiet suffering in her eyes, and he was declaring war on all of it. A single tear, the one she had refused to shed in the woodshed, finally escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. Hope, a terrifying and fragile thing, began to unfurl in her chest, delicate as a new spring leaf. Could it be true? Could this man, this king, be her salvation? Or was he just a more beautiful, more dangerous cage? Before she could process it, he was gone, organizing his children and guards. Ilara huddled in the corner of the vast carriage, her hand protectively covering the still warm mark on her other hand. She looked out the window and saw Lyra standing in the doorway of the great hall, a silhouette of fury against the firelight. Her eyes were fixed on the carriage, on Ilara, and her expression was no longer just hateful. It was calculating. The days that followed were a blur of surreal comfort and profound disorientation. The journey to Kaelin's mountain stronghold, the Eyrie, was swift and smooth. Ilara spent it wrapped in thick furs inside the impossibly luxurious carriage, the two children, Anya and Leo, watching her with a shy, persistent curiosity. They did not speak to her at first, but Anya would often hold up the small wooden bird, a silent offering of connection. Kaelin rode alongside the carriage on a massive black horse that seemed carved from shadow and fury. He was a constant, reassuring presence. Every time Ilara dared to look out the window, his eyes would be on her, a silent promise that he was there, that she was safe. The bond between them was a low, steady hum beneath her skin, a current of warmth that kept the ever-present chill of her past at bay. It was a strange comfort, this connection to a man she barely knew, yet somehow felt she had known for an eternity. Her self-doubt, however, was a stubborn weed. In the quiet moments, it would whisper its poison. "He made a mistake. He'll soon realize you are not a queen. You are a fraud, an imposter. He will tire of you." She would press her fingers against the mark on her hand, a brand of ownership she hadn't asked for, and wonder if it could be undone. The Eyrie was not a castle. It was a mountain carved into a fortress. It rose from the snow-covered peaks like a jagged crown, its towers piercing the clouds. It was breathtaking and terrifying in its scale and grandeur. This was his home. How could she, a girl who had slept on straw, ever belong in such a place? She was given rooms that were larger than the entire hovel she had grown up in. A fire always blazed in the hearth, chasing away any hint of cold. There were soft rugs on the floor, a bed piled high with furs and down pillows, and a wardrobe filled with clothes in rich, warm fabrics that felt like a sin against her skin. Servants moved around her with quiet deference, their eyes averted. They called her Luna, their voices filled with a reverence that made her want to shrink away. She was not a Luna. She was Ilara, just Ilara. She tried to help them with their tasks once, picking up a fallen tray, and they had looked at her with such horrified panic that she had retreated, feeling more useless than ever. Kaelin was patient, but his possessiveness was an iron thread woven through everything. He insisted she eat with him at every meal, sitting beside him at the head of a long, empty table in a cavernous hall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clink of silverware. He would watch her, his golden eyes intense, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You are too thin," he stated one evening, pushing a platter of roasted fowl closer to her. "Eat." "I am not very hungry," she whispered, her stomach in knots. She was not used to such rich food, to eating until she was full. His brow furrowed. "In my house, you will never be hungry again." It was an order wrapped in a promise. She forced herself to eat, feeling his gaze on her every bite. The only time she felt a sliver of normalcy was with the children. They were the reason she was supposedly here, the tutor for the king's wards. They slowly warmed to her, their initial shyness giving way to a childish openness. Leo, the boy, was quiet and observant like his king. Anya, the girl, was a whirlwind of bright energy. "Can you make another one?" Anya asked one afternoon, holding out the whittled bird. They were in the vast library, a circular room with shelves that stretched up to a domed ceiling painted with constellations. Alara hesitated. I don't have a knife." "I'll get you one," Anya declared, scrambling off the cushioned window seat. She returned minutes later with a small, elegant carving knife on a velvet tray, presented by a nervous-looking guard. It was clearly a gift from the king. She took the knife, the cool metal a familiar weight in her hand. She found a small block of wood left beside it. As she began to carve, to shape the wood into the form of a running wolf, something in her chest finally unknotted. Here, she was not a queen or a mate or a fraud. She was just Ilara, making something small and beautiful with her hands. Anya and Leo watched, captivated, their heads close to hers. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense of peace. She was so absorbed in her work she did not notice him enter. It was the shift in the air, the sudden charge of energy in the room, that alerted her. She looked up and he was there, leaning against a bookshelf, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Kalen. He was watching them, his harsh face softened by an expression she could not name. He had been giving her space, a few days to acclimate, but the bond between them pulsed with his proximity. It was a living thing, demanding, hungry. He wanted to be near her. He needed it, as much as he needed air. That night, as she lay in her impossibly large bed, sleep would not come. The silence of the fortress was different from the silence of her old life. It was not empty. It was watchful. She felt exposed, vulnerable. She missed the familiar, miserable routines. At least then she knew what to expect. Here, she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She must have been dozing when a noise startled her awake. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. A figure stood in the shadows near her window. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. An intruder, an assassin. But then the figure moved into a sliver of moonlight, and her breath caught. It was Lyra. How had she gotten here? How had she bypassed the guards of the most secure fortress in the kingdom? Lyra's face was pale, her eyes gleaming with a manic light. But it was what she saw on Lyra's tunic that made Ilara's blood run cold. A dark, embroidered symbol, a coiled serpent eating a dying star, the mark of the Ember Covenant, a cult of shadow worshippers, fanatics who believed the Alpha King's reign was a blight upon the world, a disruption of the natural order of darkness. They were whispers, ghost stories told to frighten pups, but they were real, and Lyra was one of them. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" Lyra sneered, her voice a venomous whisper. "Did you think you could just take what was mine?" "Yours?" Ilara managed, her voice trembling. "He was never yours." "His power should have been our prize," Lyra hissed, taking a step closer. "The Covenant has been planning for years to weaken him, to sever him from the wellspring of his strength, but we could never get close enough. Until you." Lyra's gaze dropped to the claiming mark on Ilara's hand, which was resting on the furs. That brand. It is not just a mark of ownership. It is a conduit, a direct channel to his soul, his power. He has made himself vulnerable, all for a worthless, pathetic Omega. Ilara finally understood. Lyra had not come here for petty jealousy. She had come on behalf of a far greater, more sinister power. "You are the key, little mouse," Lyra continued, a cruel smile twisting her lips. The Alpha King is ancient, powerful, but even he cannot survive having his soul siphoned away through his own mate. Morven will be pleased. Morven, the Shadow King, the leader of the Covenant. The name was a shard of ice in Alara's heart. Before she could scream, before she could even think to use the bond to call for Kaelin, shadows erupted from the corners of the room. They were not natural shadows. They were thick, tangible things, coalescing into the forms of hulking, monstrous men with eyes of cold ash. They seized her. Rough hands, cold as the grave, clamped over her mouth and arms. A scream was trapped in her throat, a desperate, silent plea. They dragged her from the bed, her feet tangling in the sheets. She fought, kicked, struggled with all her might, but it was like fighting against a tide of living darkness. One of the shadow men clamped a shackle around her wrist. It was made of cold, heavy silver. The moment the metal touched her skin, the bond to Kaelin screamed. It was not a severing, but a violent, agonizing suppression. It felt like a part of her soul was being ripped out, a physical agony that dwarfed any beating she had ever endured. She cried out, a choked, pain-filled sound. Through the blinding agony, she felt a distant echo of Kaelin's own shock and pain. A roar of pure, unadulterated fury that was not a sound, but a psychic shockwave that shook the very foundations of the Eyrie. He knew. He felt it. "Too late," Lyra whispered, her face close to Alara's. Her eyes danced with triumphant malice. "By the time he finds you, it will all be over." The shadows swirled around them, thick and cloying, smelling of dust and decay. The world dissolved into a vortex of blackness and pain. Alara's last conscious thought was of Kaelin's face, of the promise in his eyes. "No one will ever harm you again." He had been wrong. She woke to darkness and the biting chill of stone. The cloying scent of damp earth and decay filled her lungs. She was in a cell, rough, cold walls pressed in on all sides, and the only light was a faint, sickly green glow that emanated from phosphorescent moss growing in the cracks. Her body ached, a deep, throbbing pain that centered on her wrist. She looked down. The silver shackle was still there, bolted to a heavy chain that was fixed to the wall. The metal was ice-cold against her skin, a constant, draining presence. Where her claiming mark had once glowed with silver and gold light, it was now a dull, gray smudge, inert and lifeless. The bond was not gone. It was muffled, stifled. It was a scream trapped behind a wall of soundproof glass. She could feel the faint, frantic vibration of Kaelin's rage and terror, a distant storm on the other side of a vast ocean, but she could not reach him, and he could not reach her. The separation was a physical wound, a hollow, aching void in the center of her chest that was worse than any hunger she had ever known. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over her. She had been right. It had all been an illusion. She was not a queen. She was a pawn, a key, a thing to be used. She had allowed herself a moment of hope, and the universe had punished her for it with a cruelty that was almost artistic in its perfection. The fall from that brief, sunlit height was shattering. Footsteps echoed outside her cell, slow and deliberate. A heavy bar was lifted, and the iron-banded door groaned open. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim torchlight of the corridor. He was tall and cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to him, to be a part of him. He stepped inside, and the temperature in the cell dropped several degrees. This was not one of the shadow guards. This was power. Dark, ancient, and utterly malevolent. "So," the man said, his voice a silken, chilling whisper that slid over her skin like a slug. "This is the creature who has captivated our great Alpha King." He moved closer, and the torchlight revealed a face that was a mockery of beauty. It was all sharp angles and pale skin, with eyes as black and empty as a starless night sky. This was Morven, the Shadow King. He circled her as a wolf might circle a trapped lamb, his empty eyes studying her with a cold, academic curiosity. I admit I am disappointed. I expected more. Some great beauty, some fierce warrior. But you are just a slip of a thing. Frightened. Weak. He gestured to her ragged state. Worthless. The word, her word, struck her with the force of a slap. It was the name she had called herself for years. Hearing it from him felt like a confirmation of all her deepest fears. "Do you know what that mark on your hand represents, little mouse?" he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not need an answer. "It is the culmination of 1,000 years of his line's power, a connection to the very heart of the lifeblood that sustains him. The fool has anchored his soul to a mayfly, a beautiful, romantic, and utterly suicidal gesture." Morven crouched down in front of her, and she instinctively shrank back, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. The chain rattled, a pathetic sound. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a mouth. "His strength is tied to the land, to the light, to life itself," Morven explained, as if lecturing a dull student. "My power comes from the shadows, from the spaces in between. We are in perfect opposition, a stalemate that has lasted for centuries. But now he has given me a door. Through you, I will not just sever his connection. I will invert it. I will drain the light from him and pour my darkness in. I will hollow him out and wear his skin. I will become the Alpha King, and you, my dear, will have the honor of being the instrument of his destruction and my ascension." His plan was horrifying in its elegant simplicity. He would not just kill Kaelin, he would erase him, supplant him, become him. The thought of Kaelin's light, his strength, being corrupted by this creature's foul darkness was a violation so profound it made her physically ill. "He will find me," she whispered, the words tasting of dust and defiance. Morven's laugh was a dry, rustling sound. "Oh, I am counting on it. The ritual requires his proximity. He is coming for you, little mouse. He is tearing across the land like a storm of righteous fury, but he is walking into a trap of his own making. His love for you has made him predictable. It has made him weak." He stood up, brushing dust from his dark robes. "Rest. You will need your strength. The ritual is draining." He turned and left, the door clanging shut behind him, the bar sliding home with a sound of utter finality. Alara was left alone in the cold and the dark, with his terrible words echoing in her mind. Kaelin was coming. He was coming to save her, but he was walking into his own demise. Her capture was not just a means to an end, it was the bait. And her love for him, the burgeoning, terrified hope in her heart, was the lure. She sagged against the wall, the chain pulling at her raw wrist. Tears of pure, undiluted despair finally came, hot and silent in the oppressive darkness. She had brought this upon him. Her existence, her connection to him, was his doom. Fendrel was right. Lyra was right. Morven was right. She was worthless. Worse than worthless. She was a poison. The despair was a heavy blanket, threatening to smother her completely. It would be so easy to give up, to let the darkness take her, to simply stop. But then, through the suffocating static of the silver shackle, she felt it. A flicker. A tiny, persistent pulse against the wall of silence. It was Kaelin. It was his essence, his soul, battering against the prison they had built around their bond. It was not just rage anymore. It was a call, a name. Ilara. She closed her eyes, shutting out the cell, the cold, the despair. She focused everything she was, every ounce of her will, on that tiny flicker. She pushed back. It was like trying to shout through a hurricane. She had no strength, no energy. The silver was leaching it all away. Kaylin. She did not form the word with her mouth, but with her mind, her soul. She threw the entirety of her being into that single thought. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a surge. A powerful, overwhelming wave of his presence crashed against the barrier, and for a split second, the connection flared to life. It was agonizingly brief, but it was enough. She felt the full force of his terror for her, his earth-shattering fury at her captors, and beneath it all, a current of love so deep and absolute, it was like staring into the heart of a sun. And she heard his voice, clear as if he were standing beside her, a promise forged in the fires of his soul. "Hold on, I am coming." The connection snapped, the silence and the cold rushing back in, more profound than before. But something had changed. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her gut. But it was no longer absolute. He was coming. He knew. And his love? His love was real. It was not a mistake. A new feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, beneath the fear and the despair. It was a hot, angry coal. Rage, a deep, burning fury at Morven, at Lyra, at everyone who had ever called her worthless. They had taken her. They had hurt her. And now they were going to use her to destroy the one person who had ever looked at her and seen someone of value. They thought she was weak, a pawn, a key. They were about to find out how wrong they were. She did not know how, but she would not be the instrument of Kaylin's destruction. She would be his weapon. She gritted her teeth, the silver on her wrist burning with a cold fire. She would hold on. The ritual began in a vast, circular chamber deep beneath the earth. The air was stale and cold, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and the acrid scent of burning shadow herbs. Ilara was dragged to the center of the room and chained to a flat, black altar of polished obsidian. The silver shackles on her wrists and ankles were connected to 4 points on the stone, stretching her out like a sacrifice. Morven stood before her, flanked by Lyra and a dozen of his most powerful shadowcasters. Lyra's eyes burned with a feverish, triumphant zeal. She looked at Ilara's prone form with undisguised pleasure. "The king approaches," Morven announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "His rage is a beacon in the night. He is almost here. Let us begin our welcome." He placed his hand on Ilara's forehead. His touch was like a block of ice, leaching the warmth from her, but it was the violation of it that made her flinch. A wave of dark energy poured from him, forcing its way into the suppressed bond. It was agony, 1,000 needles of ice stabbing directly into her soul. She cried out, her back arching against the cold stone. She could feel him using her as a conduit, a siphon. He was prying open the link, not to communicate, but to drain. Through the excruciating pain, she felt Kaylin's strength begin to trickle away, pulled through her and into Morven. And in its place, Morven's darkness began to seep back toward Kaylin, a slow, insidious poison. She could feel Kaylin's distant roar of pain and confusion as the unnatural darkness touched his spirit. "Yes!" Morven hissed, his black eyes glowing with a faint, greedy light. "It works! He is weakening!" Tears streamed from Ilara's eyes, tears of pain and utter helplessness. She was failing him. She was the weapon being used to kill him, just as Morven had planned. The rage she had felt in the cell was drowned by a fresh wave of despair. She was too weak. She was nothing. And then it happened. A sound like the mountain itself cracking in two. A cataclysmic explosion ripped through the rock above them. Dust and stone rained down as a section of the cavern ceiling disintegrated. And through the hole, silhouetted against the gray dawn sky, he dropped. Kalen landed like a meteor, his impact shattering the stone floor. He was not wearing armor, only a simple black tunic and trousers, but his power was a physical shield, a raging inferno of golden light. His eyes were pure, blazing silver, and his face was a mask of divine wrath. Behind him, his elite guard, the hounds, repelled through the opening, their movements silent and deadly. The chamber exploded into chaos. The hounds engaged the shadowcasters, silver blades clashing against weapons formed of solidified darkness. The air filled with the sounds of battle, with snarls and screams. But Kalen had eyes only for two people. For Morven, who stood by the altar with a look of furious surprise, and for Alara, chained and broken upon it. "You," Kalen snarled, his voice the sound of an avalanche. He launched himself toward the altar. Morven reacted instantly. He threw up a wall of solid shadow, intercepting Kalen's charge. The two kings met in a cataclysmic collision of light and darkness. The very foundations of the earth seemed to shake with the force of their power. Alara could only watch, her heart fracturing. Kalen was here. He was fighting for her. But he was weakened. She could feel it. The ritual, however brief, had taken its toll. Morven was pressing his advantage, his shadow magic lashing out like black whips, forcing Kalen back. "You see," Morven taunted, his voice ringing out over the din of battle. "Your love has undone you. She has made you weak." Kalen staggered, a tendril of shadow wrapping around his leg, throwing him off balance. He roared in fury and pain, blasting it apart with a wave of golden energy, but the effort cost him. He was tiring. Lyra, seeing her chance, darted forward, not toward the fight, but toward Alara. In her hand was a long, thin dagger of obsidian, its edge gleaming with dark magic. "He will never have you!" she shrieked, her face a contortion of jealousy and madness. "If the Covenant can't use you, then no one will have you." She raised the dagger, aiming for Alara's heart. Time seemed to slow down. Alara saw the dagger arc downward. She saw Kalen, pinned by Morven's assault, turn his head, his eyes widening in pure, absolute terror. He screamed her name. And something inside Alara snapped. It was not a thought. It was a primal, instinctual eruption. The sight of Kalen's terror for her, the raw, selfless love in that desperate cry. It was the spark that ignited the pyre. All the pain, the fear, the rage, the lifetime of being told she was nothing, and the fierce, burning need to protect him, it all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pure will. A soundless scream tore through her soul, and from the deepest core of her being, her own power, the power she never knew she had, exploded outward. It was not darkness. It was light. A wave of pure, blinding, white-hot light erupted from her body. It was the light of a newborn star, the essence of life and healing and creation itself. The silver shackles on her wrists and ankles did not just break, they sublimated, turning to vapor in the face of a power they could not contain. The light slammed into Lyra, throwing her back like a broken doll, the obsidian dagger dissolving into dust before it could touch Alara's skin. The wave of light washed over the entire chamber. It did not harm Kalen's warriors. Instead, it enveloped them in a warm, healing glow, mending their wounds, renewing their strength. But to Morven's shadowcasters, it was anathema. They shrieked as the light touched them, their forms of solidified darkness dissolving like smoke in a hurricane. Morven himself cried out, stumbling back from Kalen as the light seared him, his own shadows receding as if in fear. He stared at Alara, no longer chained to the altar but floating an inch above it, wreathed in a soft, pulsating aura of golden white light. Her eyes were open, and they were no longer the simple brown of a servant girl. They were pools of liquid starlight. What are you?" Morven stammered, his composure shattered. Alara rose to her feet on the altar, the light flowing from her like a celestial gown. The weakness was gone. The fear was gone. All that remained was a profound, calm certainty. She looked at Morven, at the creature who had called her worthless, who had tried to corrupt the most beautiful thing she had ever known. "I am his," she said, her voice ringing with an impossible power, a harmony of light and love. "And you will not touch him." She raised her hand, the claiming mark on her skin now blazing with a light so bright it was painful to look at. She focused her will, not on destroying Morven, but on severing his connection to the darkness that fueled him. She pulled. Morven screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The shadows that clung to him were ripped away, drawn into a swirling vortex that collapsed in on itself and vanished. He was left standing there, diminished, pale, and suddenly mortal. He was just a man, a pale, frightened man stripped of his borrowed power. He stared at his hands, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Kaelin, renewed and filled with a strength that was now amplified by her own light, did not hesitate. He closed the distance between them in a single, fluid motion. He did not say a word. There was a blur of movement, a final, choked gasp from Morven, and then silence. The battle was over. Ilara's power receded, the brilliant light softening to a gentle glow. The strength left her legs, and she swayed on the altar. Before she could fall, he was there. Kaelin caught her, sweeping her into his arms, holding her against his chest with a desperation that took her breath away. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a tremor run through his massive frame. He was shaking. The Alpha King, the ancient, powerful ruler, was shaking. "I thought I'd lost you," he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion so raw it made her heart ache. "You found me," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. His skin was warm, real. He was safe. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His eyes, now a soft, warm gold, searched hers, filled with awe, relief, and a love so profound it felt infinite. "Your power," he breathed. "You are a light bringer, a soul healer, a legend I thought had passed from the world. You are not just my mate, Ilara. You are a miracle." She had no answer for that. She could only look at him, her own love for him, now fully realized and undeniable, shining in her eyes. He had not come to save a worthless Omega. He had come to save his other half, and in doing so, she had saved him right back. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but of reverence. It was the meeting of two halves of a single soul, a promise of forevers, a silent thank you in the heart of a broken mountain. It was the end of the darkness and the beginning of the light. He carried her out of the ruins of Morven's fortress, stepping from the subterranean darkness into the clean, crisp light of the new day. His hounds formed a protective circle around them, their faces grim but their eyes holding a new respect as they looked at her. She was not just the king's mate. She was the one who had turned the tide. She was their savior, their Luna. The journey back to the Eyrie was a quiet one. Kaelin refused to let her go, keeping her cradled in his lap on the back of his massive warhorse. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that was now as familiar and essential as her own. The bond between them was no longer a quiet hum. It was a vibrant, joyous song, a symphony of shared thought and emotion. She could feel his overwhelming relief, his fierce pride in her, and his boundless, shoreless love. There was no self-doubt left. The girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself to be nothing had been burned away in the crucible of her own power. In her place was someone new, someone who knew her own worth, not because a king had declared it, but because she had felt it explode from her own soul. When they arrived, the entire population of the Eyrie was waiting in the main courtyard. Servants, guards, craftsmen, and elders stood in silent vigil. As Kaelin rode through the gates with her in his arms, a collective breath was released. He dismounted but did not put her down. He walked to the center of the courtyard and stood before his people. "Morven is dead," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "The Ember Covenant is broken. The shadow has passed." A murmur of relief and celebration went through the crowd. But Kaelin held up a hand, calling for silence. His gaze dropped to her, his golden eyes soft and full of devotion. "You know that for centuries I have ruled alone," he said, his voice now softer, more personal, yet carrying to every ear. "I have waited for the other half of my soul. I have found her." He looked back at his people. "This is Alara. She is not just the Lightbringer who saved us today. She is my mate, my bond. From this day forward, she is your queen." He gently set her on her feet before him. The crowd was silent, their eyes wide with awe as they looked upon her. She was still in the simple, torn tunic she'd been captured in, her face smudged with dirt, but she held her head high. A soft, residual glow still clung to her, a faint aura of starlight. Then, an elder woman with hair as white as the mountain snow stepped forward and dropped to one knee. "Our queen," she said, her voice filled with reverence. One by one, then in a great wave, every person in the courtyard knelt before her. Guards, servants, the powerful and the humble, all kneeling. For her. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of homecoming. She turned back to Kaelin, her heart so full she thought it might burst. He had not given her this. He had simply cleared the path so she could claim it herself. She reached up, her fingers tracing the claiming mark on her hand, which now pulsed with a soft, steady golden light. It was a part of her, a brand of her destiny. But the bond felt incomplete, one-sided. He had claimed her, but she had not yet claimed him. With a newfound confidence that felt as natural as breathing, she stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She placed her palm flat against the center of his chest, directly over his heart. She felt the thunder of it beneath her hand. She pushed her own will, her own light, her own love into him through the bond. It was not a request, it was a declaration. Mine. The word was a silent vow from her soul to his. Kaelin gasped, his eyes widening. A wave of golden light flared from her hand, sinking into his chest. On the dark fabric of his tunic, directly over his heart, a new mark burned itself into existence, a faint, shimmering echo of the one on her hand. A wolf's head crowned with a crescent moon. The bond was complete, balanced, a two-way street. He looked down at the mark, then back at her, his expression one of utter, heart-stopping adoration. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle, his joyous, unrestrained laugh echoing off the stone walls of his fortress. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh, and the sound was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "My queen," he murmured against her hair, holding her tight. Just then, two small figures broke from the crowd and ran toward them. It was Anya and Leo. They did not stop at Kaelin's feet, but launched themselves at Alara the moment he set her down. Anya wrapped her arms around her waist, burying her face in her tunic. Leo, more reserved, simply took her hand, his small fingers curling around hers. "You came back," Anya mumbled into the fabric. "I told you she would," Leo said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Ilara knelt, ignoring the kneeling crowd, and wrapped her arms around both children, pulling them into a fierce hug. They were the reason she was here. The excuse he had made to bring her into his life, the pups she was meant to teach. She looked up at Kaylin over their heads, her heart overflowing. She had come here as a tutor for his children, a fraud in a palace. But she had ended up teaching a lonely, ancient king how to have a family again. And in the process, she had learned that home was not a place. It was a person. It was a family. And she was, finally, home.